Okay, let's get going here. All right, so obviously apologies for missing Friday's class. I will say you wouldn't have wanted me to be here, so it was not fun, but I will probably adjust the course content a little bit. I had kind of two more units in mind. I might just cut, depending on how today goes, I might just cut the one on unions and go straight to stress and job satisfaction. We will see. I'm sure you'll all cry big tears for less content. I know. Bear with me. A little bit less, but it's okay. Obviously, I'm kidding. Okay, so last on Wednesday of last week, we were talking about these new management techniques, and we ended talking about TQM or total quality management, which is this system, right? Which I kind of stressed all about satisfying customers, right? And really putting that constant emphasis on pushing customer service, involving the customer, right, in this kind of decision-making tree, and really kind of putting a lot of pressure. We got management, we got employees, and we got customers, putting a lot of pressure from both customers and management on the employee for these kinds of continual improvements um, in the system, right? And a lot of it is, this customer feedback, always seeking customer feedback and trying to, involve or force employees to be the central figure in sort of resolving issues. Okay. Now, TQM, like a lot of new management techniques, right, when they bring in a new management style, was kind of heralded as a win-win approach to labor management relationships. And the promise with almost every new management technique is that it's going to, increase productivity. It's going to improve relationships with management. Bring better working conditions. Work is going to be better, right? It's going to be faster, more effective because of these high performance work practices, and especially the stress on continual improvement. However, it hasn't really played out that way. Like one of the places that it was attempted and really brought in was at the Royal Alec, right? The Royal Alexandra Hospital up in North Edmonton. And they put all sorts of like TQM practices in there. The nursing staff, like from the nursing staff down to the janitorial staff, everybody was supposed to be involved in this kind of continual improvement of the workflow. Um, but what it led to is nobody really knew who was in charge, right? This idea of like democratizing the workplace and giving, employees more um, say in how to fix problems meant nobody really knew who was in charge, right? Whose responsibility it was to figure out where failures were happening. So things like, for example, one of the things that happened is the bathrooms in the Royal Alec, the level of cleanliness declined markedly. And no one really knew who was supposed to address this, right? They were like, okay, well, the cleaning staff should be, seeing the complaints and then they should be responding to it. But when they didn't, it was like, well, they're not responding. Whose job is it then to kind of force this down on them? And a lot of conflict and demoralization as lots of people. Well, the demoralization came mostly from feeling like good enough is never good enough, right? The employees were, especially the nursing staff, were like, okay, we're doing our best, but we're getting all of this negative customer feedback and being told that we need to do something actionable about it, but we don't have the resources to do something. So they would kind of get this continual, almost like continual criticism um, from customers and from management, but with no real empowerment to do anything about it. And this led to kind of growing conflicts, poor chains of command, and big problems. And, it was eventually abandoned in favor of a much more traditional hierarchical management style. And this, is pretty common with new management techniques. Oddly, people kind of like the way things have been for a long time. So you get resistance to change at various levels within organizations, and that was certainly true, at the Royal Alec. Um, And, you know, people kind of like their old existing power structures, so people cling to them. Okay, organizational cultures um, is another sort of approach to management, and it's one that you might almost say comes from anthropology in a sense. In a lot of ways, like man, like this became a big interest in the 80s, and it was, you know, still something that people really clung to in the 1990s. And there's something to it, right? There's something to kind of thinking about organizational cultures. Because any kind of workplace that you'll ever go into, right, unless you're starting one from scratch, they basically come up with their own sort of, you know, shared, like almost like a mini culture, right? A mini society. Workplaces end up being mini societies. They have sort of language, they have informal rules, they have inside jokes, hierarchies, and all of the sort of things that you would think, you know, come in terms of culture. So lots of people have suggested, you know, that we focus on, you know, when you're thinking about an organization, think of it as, you know, a culture, and think of where, you know, you can maybe tweak things, you know, rather than redesigning everything, because you're going to run up inevitably against, you know, a lot of the norms. Okay, and this is, you know, this is a kind of chart that I found that I thought was kind of a good illustration, right? This is often what people see about organizations, but like an iceberg, there's a lot below. And it's things like, you know, we've always done things that way. You come to try and change a workplace, you're going to run into things like that. You know, that's not how the way we do things. Doesn't matter what we say, nothing will ever change, right? That's the way we do things around here. Don't boil the ocean, right? Don't set the bar too high. We're different. Oh, you know, lots of workplaces have this culture that, oh, well, that might work somewhere else, but we're different. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We tried that, it doesn't work, right? And that won't work here, right? Because we're different. All of these things, these kinds of statements happen all the time. And you know, the chart has the way we really get things done. Often, you know, the way you portray a management scenario is not the way things actually happen. Okay, so yeah, large workplaces, even small workplaces, we can treat like mini societies, and they have things that you would find in societies, you know, shared beliefs. Everybody sort of thinks in the same way. You get a sort of group think, customs, like how do you do things? What's the kind of work flows, right? I've worked in, you know, workplaces where this was very regimented, but very informally, right down to like, you know, who arrived at work when, you know, who got to work when, who made the coffee in the morning, you know, who started up the computers, who logged people into the system, who, you know, what tasks were done first thing in the morning. You know, did you do like a little group meeting in the morning just to get everybody on the same page, right? All of these things were these kinds of customs. You know, and these are maybe workplaces of 10, 15 people, so not really huge. So all of, you know, all of these are kind of rituals, customs that happen within the workplace, that are very set within it. And disrupting them can be very bad. Like if you take out the person who made the coffee, right? If you let that person go, you can honestly, or that person gets transferred to another department, it can kind of throw the whole workplace into chaos, because how can we live without coffee? Things like languages, right? Not actual languages, but kind of, you know, jargon and words that are used in particular workplaces, right? If you go into a really established workplace, it'll take you a hot minute to kind of catch up on the jargon people are using. And sometimes, you know, myths, not in the kind of religious sense, but like stories about how things work, right? What the real, sometimes it's like, I always think of the myths as, you know, the real deal. Like this is actually how the company really works, and this is how things actually get done here. So lots of that. Okay. These are important, right? They serve as social glue, and you know, one of the things that studying organizational cultures kind of tells us is that undermining these things can have devastating results on corporate cohesion, right? So, yeah, lots of things are done at the informal level. Um, And they help do things like forge kind of common cultures where people are loyal to the company, and they keep countercultures within the workplace from gaining a foothold. And you really generally don't want countercultures to gain a foothold in workplaces because if you have two camps kind of working against each other in any workplace, it's going to go bad. Okay. Another kind of theory, new management theory, is what's called learning organizations, and it comes from a guy named Peter Senge. Um, And basically, in the 1990s, lots of stuff is changing. Especially, we're starting to get, the first kind of rumblings of the internet, right? The internet will become commercially available to everybody in 1995. But already by the late 1980s, early 1990s, right, digital connectivity is starting to play a bigger and bigger role. Um, and there's this sense, with globalization, which we talked about earlier in the course, that basically companies are going to be much more dynamic to survive. Okay, so what are they going to need to do? Well, they're going to need what he called learning cultures that take advantage of and enhance employee skills and knowledge. The idea here being, increase innovation and flexibility. But basically, instead of having, kind of an old way where, I graduate from university or high school or wherever I graduated from, and I come to the workplace with a set of skills, and I'm going to bring those skills to the workplace, and that's the skills I'm going to have forever. Sen said we should be kind of encouraging employees to be constantly learning new things and bringing new skills to the workplace. And then workplaces should actually invest in people, like pay for courses, pay for, even hobbies, so they can bring all of those things to their workplaces, right? So expand personal abilities, break out of old ways of thinking, develop shared visions. Team learning, right? So doing kind of constant training and working on things like broader thinking outside of just particular companies. And this is, to embrace change, increase productivity, and take advantage of a rapidly changing world. One of the examples that Senge uses is Harley Davidson back in the 90s, where Harley broadly encouraged a lot of its employees to expand their horizons. And very famously, they paid for things like, all sorts of hobby courses, any kind of course someone wanted to take, as long as it didn't interfere with their work. Harley Davidson had funds to pay for it. And Senge makes the case that this ultimately really helped the Harley Davidson brand. The brand grew tremendously in the 1990s from one that was very particularly focused on one branch of like the motorcycle industry to one that was much more widely marketed and popular. Now, I think Senge is slightly misreading what's happening there. I think what happened, you know, is a lot of baby boomers hit a midlife crisis and everybody bought a Harley. I remember this because my dad bought a Harley in the 1990s. It was a very cool bike. Never let me ride it. Sold it before it killed him. Still a lot of people kind of were like, wow, it's Harley Davidson and all their innovation. And they did come up with some nice innovations in kind of engine design. Well, there's only so much you can do with a motorcycle that really made it the leading motorcycle company in North America. But I actually think it's the midlife crisis of the baby boomers that kind of hit there. I guess the problem with learning organizations, it remains a kind of abstract concept and it's hard to implement broadly. It's like, yes, it's a great idea for your employees to be constantly learning, but how does that actually work? I would say taking like an art class genuinely be helpful to say someone working at Harley Davidson, potentially not. Okay, so his kind of 5 learning principles, um, expand your personal abilities and allow other people to do so as well. Break out of old ways of thinking, right? Again, with globalization and the internet coming, his idea was kind of, we need to change the way people think so that we're not caught off guard by the revolutions coming. I guess maybe it's smart with AI as well. You could think of this as useful. Shared visions of the future within corporations, team learning. Again, everybody should be learning and learning together. And then holistic ways of thinking. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess probably one of the places we see this actually taking place is things like with teachers, right? They do things like professional development days, those days you used to get off as a kid in elementary, junior high, and high school, um, where the teachers were at work, but you weren't. Things like teachers convention, right, where people are allowed to interact with new ideas, and things like grants, to allow teachers to do a master's degree, increase their horizons. These would be, I think, a good example, but I think education works particularly well for this. Whereas, industry, maybe not so much. Okay. I presume there was no questions there. All right. So, flexible organizations. This person is very flexible. So, flexible organizations was another principle. And again, this is coming kind of in the late 90s. This is Pure and Sable. But again, they're thinking, at the beginning of kind of the internet, and everybody, by the time you hit the late 1990s, realizes that the internet is going to be the next big thing. I mean, they're writing, I would say, very importantly, prior to the kind of advent of the two biggest companies that have really taken advantage of this, obviously Amazon and Google. After which, I actually think their insights matter a little bit less. Um, because everybody was sort of like, okay, how do we build organizations that'll work really well and pivot quickly in a fast changing environment? So they thought, you should have firms that had things like flexible specialization, right? Where everybody would have specializations, but very flexible. So, you would have flexible production systems that could react to market changes really quickly, right? Especially as you're getting more data, right? It's not like the old days where it would take data a really long time to trickle through systems because things were on paper. As they get digitized, right, you have more data coming in all the time. Computers to link all aspects of production into the whole, right? So obviously, we talked a little bit about this, say when we talked about Walmart, and Walmart's kind of pull logistics, where they constantly are telling their suppliers what they need and how much they need of it. Computers really managing things and crunching data in important ways was all part of this idea. But then, smaller production runs and innovation, rather than producing a ton of something, producing it on demand, you can think of this as maybe just in time, another way of saying just in time production. And yeah, I mean, more power to employees, less to management, right? And again, one of the principles here is flatter organizations, right? Flatter management structures. And flexible firms for them, right? Have things like functional flexibility, workers doing more, right? More variety of tasks, so that they know more of what's going on within a company and they're more adept, they're more able to move around, as tasks change. Numerical flexibility, being able to alter the size of your workforce really quickly. So things like temporary foreign workers, temps, gig workers, outsourcing. I think you could see something like Skip the Dishes or DoorDash having really embraced this in major ways, because they sort of they basically use gig workers to alter the size of their workforce as needed, and people will kind of jump in or jump out as it's possible to make money doing these things. And then, pay flexibility. This one's never been popular. Alternative wage rates for non-standard workers, right? Typically paying non-standard workers less, often even less than minimum wage. Or, potentially not paying people at all, but offering them alternative compensations. Things like stock options have been popular. Okay, I think lean is my last one. No, I have high performance workplaces. Okay, we're almost done with this. Okay, so lean production. And again, probably the biggest, the big one when we talk about lean, the company that leaned, terrible pun, which I did not do on purpose, most on this was Boeing, right? Especially Boeing in the 2000s and 2010s before Boeing really ran into problems. They had really focused on lean production, especially in their Seattle kind of their Seattle factories. Okay, so what is lean production? Um, the idea is, low costs, reduced lead times, and high quality. One of the big things, I don't know if I have it on the next, no, I don't have it on the next slide. Okay, so what do they have, right? So obviously, lean production, advanced production technologies, as much automation as possible. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about, kind of those Swedish work reforms, um, and things like QWL, right? Self-managed work teams. So, and I guess you see this a little bit in the Toyota kind of Japanese management as well. Self-managed work teams, right? Allowing workers to sort of set their own conditions for work. They have quotas to meet, but how they meet them is up to them. Things like, and you can see, the influence of Japanese management, right? Even the word Kaizen. Worker initiated continuous improvement and innovation. These are your, quality circles, quality circles, or the idea that your employees should be the ones initiating quality improvements all the time. Same kind of thing as we saw with some others, flexible production systems, especially things like, just-in-time inventories so that you can scale up and scale down without too much cost. You're getting parts as you need them, you're pulling from your suppliers as you need them, so you're not sort of stuck in a position where you have a lot of capital outlays in terms of money you've spent on spare parts or extra parts for jets or whatever you happen to be making. So that you can, if demand goes down, you can very quickly scale down without having a bunch of extra spare parts sitting in a warehouse somewhere gathering dust that you've already paid for and that you're therefore kind of liable for. This one I think is, the one of the big ones with lean production. It always aimed for zero downtime and zero defects, right? So that its products would essentially be perfect, but it would require never, no downtime in terms of taking the production line down to fix production problems, right? So, obviously this was a big problem with auto manufacturing, especially some of the American firms. I guess the Korean firms have had trouble with this as well, less the Japanese firms, but having to shut down whole production lines because there's a fundamental flaw in your design or some problem in your production process has obviously been something that companies don't want to do. So the idea is, right, catch the defects before they get serious or before they manifest, and then, you can stop downtime from happening. Now, obviously, with the Boeing example, this idea of zero downtimes has conflicted with the zero defects, and this is what often happens with lean production, is the zero downtime ends up being the one that's more important because that's profit, right? So you can look at like, the 737 MAX, the one famous airliner that has had so many problems for Boeing. They went with this kind of zero downtime lean production strategy for building them, and it's cost them tremendously because the plane is riddled with problems. To the point where my boss, I used to book flights for her in the job I had just a few, like last year. And I had to always check if she was flying on a 737 MAX because she refused to fly on them. So she would only fly Airbus, but she's German, so she just wanted to fly on European airplanes all the time. But I had to like sometimes be like, okay, this flight is 45 minutes longer, but you're on an Airbus. Do you want me to book that one or the one on the 737 MAX, right? So lots of very public problems with the 737. We've talked a bunch about just-in-time inventories. right? Never having really spare parts, only having the parts you need all the time, right? And it's a kind of pull style of logistics where you're getting parts from suppliers and they're producing them as you need them. And then bonuses based on performance, right? This is kind of and I'll talk about this on the next slide. It's a Taylorist kind of way of thinking, right? Which is why sometimes lean production gets called a form of neo-Taylorism, because it's like the idea of piecework, right? Okay, how many widgets are you producing? You get paid per widget. Here it's like, okay, if our performance is good, you get bonuses. If our production isn't, you don't get them. I mean, I think the CEOs always get bonuses, but that's how it goes. Okay, so lean has been criticized, as I just said, for being a sort of neo-Taylorist way, re-engineering tasks to try and make things more efficient without necessarily, making them more humane or human. Sometimes like giving people just more tasks to do, overloading workers in order to get more production, and especially putting stress on bonuses has often led to people working harder and faster, which has things like competition with other factories, trying to sort of say, okay, we're in competition. If you guys win, you get this production bonus. If they win, they get it. Trying to create competition to get people working harder. But this faster pace, and this under lean, GM adopted lean production as well. Um, so basically, it went from people were busy, it went from being 45 out of every 60 seconds, right? They had a task to do, to being 57 out of 60 seconds, that's particular GM plans. Which I mean is great if you're the employer, right? You just got another essentially 12 seconds of productivity out of people. But it increased things like stress, injuries, and job satisfaction went down, retention went down as well. So lean is often, sort of now talked about. It was the buzz in the 2000s and 2010s, and now it's sort of looked down upon a little bit as just being, an attempt to get more out of employees. Okay, so last kind of, new management technique, what's called high performance workplaces, which is another sort of vague, some of these like, TQM, learning organizations, flexible organizations, I'm convinced at times are just ways for management consultants to repackage a bunch of the same ideas together, sell them to corporations, and continue to rake in all of those sweet consultant bonuses with a lot of management speak. And I've always thought of high performance workplaces kind of similar. Again, you'll see a lot of similar things, right? The idea, employee involvement in decision making. Okay, right? If employees are involved, they're going to be more invested. Again, right from like Swedish reforms, right? We get the idea of team, and Japanese management, right? Team organization with and flexible work design. People being able to design their own workflows, training and learning opportunities, right? These are our learning organizations. Open information sharing, right? This is something like management transparency, telling workers what's going on, and then things like, financial incentives for performance. So things like profit sharing, but also risk sharing. And sometimes this takes the point or takes the reduced pay, right? So it has the effect of reducing pay because they'll be like, well, we'll profit share. At the end of the year, if there's profit, everybody will get a bonus as part of the profit, but you'll take less money now. Now, that's great if the company you work for happens to be making a profit. If the company you work for is not making a profit, that is not good, right? So you're also risk sharing. The idea, I think, there is having people more invested in how well the company is doing, because if you happen to get a profit, you get a share of it. And if you don't, right, you lose out. Now, I mean, that's great, but if you don't make a profit, you've just lost out. And you probably took a lower wage to do that. Stock options are another way that people sometimes do this, right? You'll get some form of your compensation in stock options, which again is really great if the company is doing well. If the company is not doing well, and your stock options decline, that's not so great. Anyway, I won't talk about stock options. They work out sometimes. Let's say if you worked at Tesla in the early days, you did very well with your stock options, as long as you sold them at the right time. However, I've heard of other stories, where people took compensation at like mid-sized oil companies in terms of stock options, and the company basically lost a bunch of contracts, it went out of business, and all the stock options ended up being worth next to zero. So it works out sometimes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, focusing on work environments that improve health, supporting families. However, doesn't include guaranteed employment security. You're not the CEO, you're not the owner, you just work there. And it's been seen more as a model for workplaces rather than anything that actually exists, or principles that you can implement. And most places implement them piecemeal, right? They don't implement everything. So yeah, only a few organizations have taken this up, and I think more European ones than American or Canadian ones. Okay, got 18 minutes today. Maybe we'll start on unions. I think I have it open. Do I have it open? Oh, I thought I had it. The U of A wants me to give money. That's what I know. Okay. Okay. I just always have to make sure the live stream is working. Okay. So, unions. My sound works.
Smithers, where's that union representative? He's 20 minutes late.
I don't know, sir. He hasn't been seen since he promised to clean up the union.
Whoa! What the hell? Well, let's look at the contract ourselves, eh? Benefits, perks, a green cookie on St. Patrick's Day. Oh, it didn't used to be this way, Smithers. No, it didn't used to be this way at all. Come on, crack those atoms. You, turn out those pockets. Atoms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of them. Take him away.
You can't treat the working man this way. One day we'll form a union and get the fair and equitable treatment we deserve. Then we'll go too far and get corrupt and shiftless. And the Japanese will eat us alive.
The Japanese? Those sandal-wearing goldfish tenders? Bosh, Flimshaw.
Come gather round, children, it's high time ye learned about a hero named Homer and a devil named Burns. We'll march till we drop, the girls and the fellas. We'll fight till the death or else fold like umbrellas. So we'll march day and night by the big cooling tower. They have the plant, but we have the power. So we'll march day and night by the big cooling tower. They have the plant, but we have the power. So we'll march day and night by the big cooling tower. They have the plant, but we have.
Those, right? Without workers, there is no industry. So industry needs workers, and therefore workers, especially when they work together, have the power. All right, one last Simpsons clip. Oh, this is on teachers' unions.
Well, she's just a substitute. Maybe you could transfer Miss Cantwell to another school.
Nix.
She's already got 2 weeks tenure, so she's impossible to dislodge.
I hate unions. There's this guy at my plant, caused 3 meltdowns, and he still keeps his job.
Homer, that's you.
Oh, yeah. I say union, you say power! Union!
Power,
Union!
power.
Marge, you're really donging it on the power. But don't worry, because of the union, you're safe.
Okay. So, unions, right? This kind of falls into our kind of, conflict and cooperation kind of schools of thought when it comes to work and industry. So, the main power that unions have is what's called collective bargaining, right? Where the union, representing all of the workers, negotiates with the employer to come up with an agreement that covers all workers, right? So that's what's called collective bargaining, right? We all bargain as a collective. So for example, like right now in Alberta, the teachers unions, the ATA, are negotiating collectively with the school boards, therefore the government, for raises in pay, which they haven't gotten in like 10 years. Through a collective bargaining process, and OSHWA, the professors union or academic staff union on campus, is currently negotiating with the university for a new collective agreement. And my understanding is it's not going that well. So hey, maybe if you can get out earlier than later, my guess would be the union's going to be pushing for a strike sometime late next year around final exams, usually either in December or April of next year. So, if you can graduate before then, maybe do that. So, collective bargaining or collective agreements, right? A collective agreement covers a specific period of time, right? So it'll be something like, if we sign a new one, I guess because like OSHWA or the professors union hasn't had a contract, our contract expired in 2023, I think. So it would cover 2023 to, I don't know, let's say it's for 5 years, 2028, right? So it has a specific time. Covers things like wages, work hours, schedules, benefits, working conditions, right? This is much more typical of industrial unions, right? That cover like how workers are going to be treated, what kind of safety concessions employers are going to make, all of these sorts of things. So all of this, right? The power of workers is all predicated on a threat of conflict, and specifically a threat that workers could collectively withdraw their labor, essentially rendering, the employer unable to function, right? If all the workers at an auto plant leave, there's nobody to work. If all the professors stop teaching, then, there's no one to run the university, right? The whole thing kind of shuts down. And it's often seen as this kind of zero-sum game, right? Where, a zero-sum game is basically where at the end of whatever happens, what's left over is zero. So either the employer wins or the workers win, but not both sides can't win at the same time. Okay. So unions, the kind of Marxist critique of unions has been that they're actually pretty good at managing discontent in workers and have actually been a pretty effective tool for keeping capitalism running, right? Because they do things like channeling worker complaints and articulating problems and needs. Without them, without unions, ultimately, sometimes worker needs go unmet, worker complaints go unmet, because there's such a power disparity between employers and employees, that then there's, things will break out at some point into general strikes or workers' revolts, and we've certainly seen this in the past, where the whole kind of system falls apart because conditions have gotten so bad. And it may, there's a maintenance of capitalism aspect in that unions will reduce power imbalances, not get rid of them. And here, you can think of the period of time from about 1930 to the 1970s, which is kind of the peak of the union movement. There was lots of work disruptions during this period, and unions were very powerful, but economic inequality was at its kind of lowest ebb that it has ever been, right? The difference between the richest people and kind of the average was the smallest it's ever been. So it reduced those power imbalances. And I mean, most people remember this period as one that was pretty harmonious politically, socially, economically. So it definitely has its advantages. Okay. Unions do, however, have their issues, right? There's what's called, union democracy, but also an iron law of oligarchy. So, leaders of unions, right? Well, they're often drawn from the particular working class or the group of people that they seek to represent. They often specialize in being in unions, right? And there are specific things that you have to do in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of positioning, language, all these sorts of things that allow you to be an effective union worker. It's not the easiest thing to just jump in and become, the head of a union. I know Homer Simpson does it in that one episode of The Simpsons, but I mean, arguably he doesn't do it very well. All he wants is his dental care plan back because Lisa needed braces. And that's what he settles the whole strike on. He gets his dental care plan back, and the workers basically get nothing. There's a lot of expert knowledge, which means union leadership is often a kind of super powerful class within the working class, right? So they sort of rise to the top, and they often exert a lot of power. And there's a lot of arguments that they do a lot of things to maintain their power. This is especially true. Well, okay, let's put it this way. Typically speaking, most unions have voted and supported in Canada the New Democrats, right? The New Democratic Party. Until really recently, actually. This election is a weird one because a lot of industrial unions are supporting the Conservatives, and a lot of public sector unions are supporting the Liberals. So it's a weird, and the NDP is out in La La Land. But why? Well, because it's been an effective way for them to channel, especially at the provincial level, some of the money they get from members into actual political power, right? So they create a sort of system that allows them to benefit, right? They support particular politicians that support them, and it allows union leadership to maintain their power. And some of the union leaders at the big unions have been in those positions for decades, right? So we see a lot of that. Okay, 6 minutes? You can do a few more. Just burning through them. All right, so the economic impact of unions is pretty marked, right? We talked about this earlier in the course when we talked about good jobs. Having, being in a union or a professional association that represents you tends to mean higher wages, right? And this is sometimes called the union wage premium. And if you look at particular sectors, what you'll see is that people doing similar jobs, one in a place that is unionized and one where they aren't, will tend to have markedly higher wages. And you can think of like automotives, right? That sunsetting industry. If you look at Michigan versus, say, Alabama, so Michigan is a union state, Alabama is non-union. The wages for auto workers in Alabama are considerably lower than they are in Michigan. Same thing for like teachers. If you look at Massachusetts in the US, those are pretty high. That's unionized and that's pretty high wages. But if you looked at, Mississippi, my SSI, yeah. You have relatively low wages for teachers because it's non-unions, right? Same job, same qualifications basically, but you get the union wage premium in those unionized kind of regions. Okay, more likely to receive more and better non-wage benefits, right? So medical care, dental care, all of that stuff broadly improved when you have a union, right? Because they will negotiate those collective agreements with the employer, and they're like, okay, look, you give us this, or we're all withdrawing our labor. And so you get, less, when you have lots of unions, less wage inequality. And where you've seen this is typically a couple of places, large workplaces in the core sector. So, manufacturing, tech, a little bit. Tech is not super unionized. But then the public sector. Public sector has a ton of unionization. And we'll talk about that as we go through, because really now there's all in Canada and the US, there's almost more public sector, so government worker unionization than there is private sector. Okay, so there's two kind of faces to unions, right? The monopoly face, power to raise members' wages at the expense of employers and non-unionized workers, right? So they present a monopoly of the workers and they can demand more. And then the collective voice face, the one that is about democratizing authoritarian workplaces by speaking as one, right? You can get things that the workers want by kind of demanding them as a whole, right? So you have that collective voice and you're like, hey, we want, improved safety conditions or whatever it happens to be. Excuse me. So our first way, we kind of split, our union movements into three broad kind of periods or waves. Maybe I'll talk about the first one really quickly here. The first wave, right, which is pre-1930s, right? So really we're probably thinking somewhere starting in like the 1850s, going, to, let's say 1929 or so. And what did you have, right? So prior to this, right, or actually, sorry, that's not right. Even before then, I'm going to scratch those out. This is going back, to the pre-industrial period. Sorry, this is kind of feudal Europe. You had, I got it confused with my next one. You had this kind of slow development of kind of workers' movements that was happening even in the Middle Ages. So you had things like skilled craftsmen, right? Or sometimes they were referred to as guilds, that controlled, the production of certain goods, right? So printers, carpenters, bricklayers, shoemakers, tailors, right? Blacksmiths, they were all in kind of guilds that controlled access to the profession. So they said who was trained and who could be trained, who could call themselves, a particular skilled craftsman and all of that. So they were seen as kind of the aristocrats of labor, the unskilled were excluded. And this kind of goes until industrialization hits, right? When industrialization hits, all of this stuff kind of goes away because suddenly unskilled workers are doing much more of the work. And a lot of these kind of guilds and skilled craftsmakers disappear. Clock turned off. Okay. Once you get into kind of the industrial period, you get a bunch of movements trying to form right through like the 1850s to the 1930s to get more rights for workers. So there's lots of things like the Knights of Labor, the One Big Union, and they do make gains, right? Like say in industrializing England, they get things like a 9-hour, they advocate for a 9-hour workday, but they don't make much in terms of gains because they have little bargaining power and they're not really together. And it really doesn't coalesce until the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, where you get things like concerted, trade and labor congresses, and then, unions that actually have some teeth. And we'll talk about the Winnipeg General Strike next time. The Winnipeg General Strike, where everyone in Winnipeg went on strike, was one of 400 general strikes in 1919 in Canada, right? So unions started to get much more powerful and it changed the balance. But I'm out of time, so I will leave it there. We'll see you on Wednesday and we'll get as much done as we can then. Okay.